It's Anzac Day, 1935. It's a Saturday afternoon, warm and bright, and the Coogee aquarium baths are packed. Families mostly. Kids have been dragged along after the morning services. Everyone is dog-tired from being awake since before dawn, but well and truly distracted by the fact that there is a live tiger shark in the pool. A 4-metre, 1-tonne tiger shark. And they've paid good money to stand here on the timber decking and check it out. The shark's been here for 8 days already. For the first few days, it was quite the spectacle. This enormous, slow-moving shape cutting back and forth effortlessly. It made people near the edge step back from the railing. It ate whatever was put in front of it. It was, by every measure, absolutely thriving. But today, the shark seems a bit off. It's slow, sluggish. It's moving in a slightly erratic way that suggests all is not well. Listing a little to the side, not quite tracking straight. Even the children watching from the decking have noticed, and some of them are pointing. Their parents are watching too, puzzled. Maybe the shark's just having an off day. Too long been stuck in this pool. But then the water at the bottom of the pool starts to churn. What happens next takes just seconds. But nobody watching in that crowd forgets it for the rest of their lives. The shark convulses, a hard, full body shudder, and then, in the middle of all of those upturned faces and the warm Anzac Day sun, it vomits. What it brings up is a rat, a bird, and a human arm. A left arm, to be precise, and there's a length of rope attached to the wrist. And on the inside of that forearm, a tattoo. The tattoo is roughly 20 centimetres high. The crowd at the railing goes very quiet at first. And then one woman, overcome by the smell and the sight, turns to vomit. And then some of the children begin to cry. Chaos ensues. One of the police officers who attends from Randwick will later say the thing that got to him, the detail that stayed with him for years, was not the arm itself. It was the length of rope around the wrist. This was not an accident. It is the beginning of one of the strangest murder cases in Australian history. G'day, I'm your storyteller, Mark, and this is Struth, the podcast where we go digging in the corners of Australian history that textbooks didn't get around to covering. Sometimes we find injustice, sometimes we find a bit of mystery, and sometimes we find a bit of both. Today's case, the shark arm case, is a request from Kerry over on the Facebook group. You can find the links to all of our social media in the show notes below. Make sure you check it out if you haven't already. Also, I'd just like to give a shout out to all of the new listeners here on Struth. Plenty of new people have found the show over the last couple of weeks, so I'd like to welcome you and also thank all of the wonderful Struth listeners for telling a friend and sharing the show on their social media networks. It means a lot to me, so I'm glad you're enjoying it. And here's to plenty more episodes. But let's go back to Sydney in April of 1935 to continue our story. And it was, at that time, a city that was not having a good time with sharks. In late February and early March, 3 young men had been taken by sharks at New South Wales beaches. 3 people with their whole lives ahead of them. Gone. The newspapers were calling sharks public enemy number 1. Bounty hunters were being paid to clear the water, and there was a general sense of dread along the coastline. And into this climate of anxiety, Charlie Hobson had a business idea. Hobson, you see, ran the Coogee Aquarium Baths, a large saltwater indoor pool on the foreshore near Coogee Beach, and business had been a bit slow. But Hobson had recently acquired something that he thought might turn his fortunes around. It was a 4-metre tiger shark, caught off Sydney 8 days earlier and still alive. And so he put it in the pool. He opened the doors and he waited for the punters and their cash to start rolling in. And it would seem that Charlie was certainly onto something. Sydney-siders came in droves to look at the thing that might kill them. Of course they did. And for 8 days the shark performed its function admirably, eating, circling, being generally enormous and menacing and alive in a controlled environment where it couldn't get at anyone. And by Anzac Day, the 25th of April, it was the attraction of the season. And then, as we heard in the opener, the shark ruined everything for Charlie Hobson. The initial assumption, when the arm came up, was another tragedy. Another victim of the waters off Sydney. Another poor, unlucky soul. But the medical examination that followed changed that perspective entirely. The arm had not been bitten off. There was no evidence of shark damage at the point of separation. The cut was clean and deliberate, made with a knife or something similarly sharp by someone who knew what they were doing. This arm had been removed from a body by another person, and whoever that person was, they had tied a rope to the wrist before disposing of it. The gastric juices of a tiger shark are famously powerful. Hydrochloric acid at a concentration that will dissolve bone over time. The arm had likely been in the shark's stomach for between 8 and 18 days, given the state of preservation. The fact that it was recognisable at all was remarkable. The fact that the tattoo was still legible was, as it turned out, the break the investigation needed. A boxer squaring up on the inside of a left forearm. A man by the name of Edwin Smith is eating breakfast on a Sunday morning when he reads about the arm. He has the Truth newspaper open on the kitchen table beside his tea. It's a Sunday morning ritual. He's mid-bite into a piece of Vegemite toast when the headline catches his attention. "What sick shark revealed," it read. He then reads the detail that stops him cold. A tattoo on the inside of a left forearm. A boxer shaping up to fight, 20 centimetres high. The toast slips from his hand and drops straight down the front of a clean shirt. He reads it again and doesn't want to believe what this description is confirming. His brother, James, has a tattoo exactly like that. His brother James, who nobody has seen for several weeks. He pushes the newspaper to one side and picks up the telephone. The Vegemite is still visible on his shirt when the constables arrive to interview him, and his tea sits next to the paper. Cold. Fingerprints later confirm Edwin's fears. The arm belonged to James Jim Smith. Jim was 35 years old, born in England and raised in Australia, and living in Balmain with his wife and child. He had, in the past, managed a billiard saloon, the kind of place where Vice did a quiet but steady trade, and had worked on and off as an SP bookmaker. He was bankrupt and had a record of minor convictions, and he had spent enough years loosely connected to Sydney's underworld to know a few people that he probably shouldn't have. Jim was by no means on his own living this type of lifestyle. Sydney in 1935 was a city in the grip of things that polite society preferred not to look at directly. The Depression had been grinding people down for 6 years. Men who had worked all their lives were flat broke. Families were doing it properly hard. And into that desperation, an underworld had quietly expanded. Illegal gambling, cocaine, prostitution, no longer tucked away in quiet corners of the city. These things are now openly operating, confidently, because the men running them had relationships with the right people. The area around King's Cross and East Sydney, Darlinghurst specifically, had acquired a nickname at this time. Razorhurst, named for the weapon that the gangs that roamed the streets preferred. There were battles over territory, over cocaine distribution, over the brothels along the back streets. The unwritten rules of this world were few, but they were absolute. You did not inform on your associates. You did not go out of your way to draw attention, and you settled your debts. And if someone broke those rules, there were consequences. Jim Smith had spent years drifting along the edges of this world. He wasn't a major figure, but he was a bloke who was known to do the odd favour, run the occasional errand, and know a few things he probably shouldn't have known, including things about one Reginald Lloyd Holmes. Holmes was, on the surface, a Sydney success story. He ran a highly regarded boat building operation on the harbour foreshore at McMahon's Point, overlooking Lavender Bay. He had a prestigious residence there, a family, membership at the Royal Sydney Yacht Club. He was, by all outward appearances, exactly the kind of industrious, respectable businessman that Sydney in the 1930s admired. He was also, on the side, running one of the more lucrative criminal enterprises in the city. Holmes, you see, controlled a smuggling ring. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Ships passing through Sydney Heads, inbound from Asia, from South America, from wherever the supply was coming from, would throw contraband overboard at prearranged points. This included cocaine, cigarettes, all sorts of other goods. Holmes's men, in fast speedboats built at his own boathouse, would collect the packages before they drifted or sank. They'd bring them ashore and distribute them around the city. And these boats were good. They were built by the man who owned the operation specifically for this task. They were fast enough to stay well clear of the water police, and the harbour was busy enough that if you knew what you were doing, you could move through it largely unnoticed. The former owner of the arm, Jim Smith, had driven one of these speedboats. He was a sometimes employee of Holmes, trusted with the collection runs. He knew the operation well enough to be useful to it, and well enough to be dangerous to it. And at some point, the exact details remain uncertain, Smith and Holmes had had something of a falling out. There was a failed insurance scheme, the specifics of which were never made fully public at trial. But Smith, now bankrupt, in debt, with no income and a detailed knowledge of Reginald Holmes's criminal operation, had allegedly begun blackmailing him. This is the motive, or at least it was the closest thing to a motive that the investigation ever produced. Police investigations at the time found that Smith had last been seen drinking with a man named Patrick Brady at the Cecil Hotel in Cronulla. They'd left together and gone back to a cottage Brady was renting on the shore of Gunnamatta Bay. Patrick Brady was well known to police. He was a World War I veteran, and he was also an expert forger. Talented enough that his work had come to the attention of law enforcement on more than one occasion, and he and Smith went back a long way. After that night at Gunnamatta Bay, Smith was never seen alive again. The morning after Smith was last seen, Brady hailed a cab in Cronulla. The driver was asked to take him to North Sydney, and when they got there, Brady directed the cab to a specific house. It was the home of Reginald Holmes. Brady was later described by the driver as dishevelled, nervous, with one hand kept in his coat pocket the entire trip. He also kept looking over his shoulder, checking whether anyone was following them. The police had their link. Brady had gone directly from the place Smith was last seen to the home of the man Smith was alleged to be blackmailing. And whatever had happened at Gunnamatta Bay, Brady had taken something to Holmes. The working theory, which has never been formally proven, but has also never been satisfactorily disproved, is this. Brady killed Smith at the Gunnamatta Bay cottage. He cut off the arm, possibly to conceal the identity of the body, the boxing tattoo. He then took it to Holmes as some form of proof that the problem had been solved, or as leverage to extract payment. And he later disposed the arm off the cliffs at Maroubra. The rest of Smith was given what locals called a Sydney send-off, weighed down and dropped into the ocean from a boat. The arm went into the water. The shark then turned this run-of-the-mill Sydney crime yarn into one of the most bizarre moments in Australian history. But all of this was no more than circumstantial. The police had a cab driver. They had timing. They had a link between Brady and Holmes. But what they did not have was a confession, or a body, or a murder weapon, or a witness to the actual crime. Regardless of this, they arrested Brady and brought him to Central Police Station, and they also brought in Holmes. Holmes denied knowing Brady at all. And so, as it stood at this point in time, Brady, still in custody, denying absolutely everything. Holmes too, denying everything, including the fact that he even knows Brady. The case the police have built is entirely circumstantial, and the investigation appears to be stalling right in front of them. The police have hit a brick wall when Reginald Holmes inexplicably decides to do something that is, even by this story's standards, absolutely extraordinary. On the 20th of May 1935, Holmes left his boat shed at McMahon's Point in one of his own speedboats. He took it out into the harbour, and once he was clear of the foreshore, he put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. What exactly happened in that moment, whether he flinched, whether the shot connected and simply wasn't enough, or whether the recoil threw his arm, nobody really knows. But what is known is that he went into the water, alive, but unconscious. And as he fell, a rope trailing from the boat caught around one of his wrists and held him at the surface, stopping him from going under and drowning. The cold harbour water did the rest. He came back to himself quick enough to drag his body back aboard the boat. And by this point, the water police had been alerted to the fact that the shot had been fired, that something was happening on the harbour that required their immediate attention. And what followed was a 4-hour speedboat chase. So picture this for a moment. 1935, a Tuesday morning. The harbour is alive with ferry traffic. The Manly ferry making its runs, the smaller harbour ferries weaving between the foreshores. And through all of this, a very fast speedboat is tearing around the water with the police in pursuit. Its owner has recently been shot in the head and knocked at least partially unconscious, but he is still apparently determined to go somewhere at really great speed. Holmes darts through the mid-morning ferry traffic past Circular Quay. He went the full length of the harbour. The chase went on for 4 hours until finally, a couple of kilometres outside of Sydney Heads, Holmes gave up. He cut the engine and he let the water police pull alongside. When they got him aboard the police boat, he was bleeding profusely from his head wound and not entirely coherent, but he was talking. He said, "Jimmy Smith is dead and there's only another left If you leave me until tonight, I will finish him." Holmes was then hospitalised, and when he was well enough to speak properly to police, he began to talk. A rambling account, not always consistent, but pointing the finger directly at Brady. Holmes claimed that he had nothing to do with Smith's death. Brady had done it. Brady was the one who had come to his house that morning, and Brady was entirely responsible. He agreed to testify at the coronial inquest into Jim Smith's death, which was scheduled for the 12th of June. It was set to be the moment everything would either come together and finally make sense, or completely fall apart. Dawes Point at 1 a.m. in June is about as empty as Sydney gets. The wharves are quiet, the water is black, and the only sound is the slow knock of timber against the pylons. There is nobody here at this hour who does not need to be here, which is why, when a night worker notices the Nash sedan sitting alone near the water with no obvious reason to be there, he goes over to take a look. The engine is off. The car is dark. And the man behind the wheel isn't moving. That man is Reginald Holmes. He's 53 years old, and he's been shot 3 times in the chest. He's been dead for some time, and the car is cold. The harbour goes about its slow business behind him, indifferent to the events of this night. There are no witnesses to the crime, no weapon, nobody in the surrounding area heard a thing. Whoever put those 3 bullets into Reginald Holmes did it cleanly, in the dark, in a part of the city where people understood that some things were better not noticed, and then walked away into the night without leaving anything behind. The inquest into the death of Jim Smith was scheduled to begin in a matter of hours. Holmes, as we mentioned, had agreed to testify, and he was, as far as anyone knew, the one man alive who could put the whole story in front of a coroner under oath. But he never got that chance. The Crown case against Brady, which had been shaky at best, now collapsed entirely. Without Holmes's testimony, there was almost nothing. The cab driver did give evidence at the trial. He described Brady as agitated, dishevelled, keeping a hand in his coat pocket throughout the entire journey. He said Brady appeared convinced he was being followed. It painted a picture of a guilty man. But in reality, all it did was put him in a taxi to North Sydney. It did not put him in a cottage in Cronulla, taking the arm off a dead man with a very sharp knife. The trial was over in less than 2 days. The judge directed a verdict of not guilty, and so Patrick Brady walked out of court a free man. He died in Concord Hospital in 1965, a World War I veteran aged around 70, having never been convicted of anything in connection with Jim Smith's death. Jim Smith's arm was all that was ever recovered of him. With the trial over, the case didn't so much close as it did dissolve. No one was convicted. No one was formally accused of Holmes's murder. The inquest reached no conclusion. The files went into a drawer somewhere, and Sydney got on with the business of being Sydney. But information kept coming out in fragments in the years after. One of the more significant pieces was this. Jim Smith had been a police informer, a fizz gig, as they were called at the time, and at some point before his death, Smith had informed on a young man named Eddie Wayman. And as a direct result of Smith's information, Wayman and a mate had been caught red-handed raiding a bank. Wayman was not a minor figure. He was regarded as one of the most dangerous criminals operating in Sydney in the 1930s. A man with a proven willingness to use violence and a deep familiarity with the underworld code that had only one rule where informers were concerned. The author, Alex Castles, who wrote the most thorough account of the case, put Wayman forward as the most likely suspect for Holmes's murder. The logic is straightforward enough. Holmes, under pressure, had agreed to testify. He was about to speak to a coroner under oath about the criminal operation he'd been running, which would drag in the involvement of plenty of others. Wayman, whose freedom and reputation depended on the silence of people like Holmes, had both the motive and the capability to ensure that silence was maintained. It was never proven, and Wayman was never charged in connection with Holmes's death. That case too remains open. So we're not left with a conviction for the death of Jim Smith or Holmes. No justice in any formal sense. We're left with a shark vomiting an arm into a public pool in front of a packed Anzac Day crowd. And we're left with the slow unravelling of a web of connections that the courts were never quite able to tie together into anything that would hold. Either Brady was guilty or he wasn't. Either Holmes was complicit or he was a victim of circumstances. Either Wayman killed Holmes to keep him quiet or someone else did. You can take your pick. The limited evidence, such as it was and such as it still is, doesn't settle the matter in any meaningful way. What it does do, though, is give us a window into a Sydney that the Harbour Bridge postcards don't quite capture. A city where a respectable boatbuilder from Dawes Point was running cocaine through the heads, where a bankrupt billiard hall manager thought he could blackmail his way out of trouble, where a forger who knew better than anyone how to make things look like something they weren't supposed to ended up walking free, and where someone, on the night before an inquest, made absolutely sure the only man willing to talk would never get the chance. The arm was the only indisputable thing that we ever received from this case. One arm with a boxing tattoo and a length of rope at the wrist, brought back up by a sick tiger shark who'd had enough of being in a tiny pool. It was enough to open the case and to start this amazing tale. And it was also enough to identify the first victim. But it was never enough to close the case. Struth. Thanks again for hanging out with me for another week and listening to another bizarre, inexplicable Aussie tale. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this one was a request from Kerry over in the Facebook group, so make sure you check it out. If you want even more Struth in your life, you can sign up for the premium subscription over on Patreon. $5 a month, and there's about a dozen episodes there that you can't hear anywhere else already, with a new one each week. In addition, you get our regular feed 1 week early and ad-free. But the other way that you can continue to support the show is just to tell a friend. Post it up on social media, give us a like, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. All those little things make a huge difference. Cheers.